The morning light came in low and flat across Comanche Station that May, without warmth or ceremony, just a slow gray, brightening over the cottonwood line along the South Canadian. Dale Coleman stood in front of Webb's trading post, with his Winchester held at his side and 3 men positioned in the road before him. Ellis Voss at center, 30 feet out, the way a man stands when he is used to being the last word in a conversation. Dade Tatum to Voss's left at 40 feet, his hand already drifting toward his holster in the casual way of someone who had done this before and found it uncomplicated. Roy Crane to the right at 45 feet, blocky and shoulder forward, leaning into the ground like a door about to be forced. Thomas Coleman stood at the hitching post behind his father with both hands at his sides. He was 16 years old. He was too close to what was coming. There was nothing to be done about that now. None of them moved. The creek ran somewhere behind the cottonwoods. A horse shifted its weight at the rail. If you've been with this channel through any of the stories we've told, you know the territory held more of these mornings than history chose to record. What follows goes back 11 years before that road was set. In 1871, the Bureau of Indian Affairs assigned 640 acres of land along the South Canadian to Dale Coleman by name. The deed was filed in his name alone, pursuant to the allotment terms the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 had established for Kiowa band members who were willing to settle and work. The land ran from a dry scrub oak ridge on the western margin to a shallow drainage creek on the east that flooded in wet springs, cracked in dry ones, and held cattle-grade grass in enough of the years between to matter. 640 acres was not wealth. It was what a man could work, which was a different measure, and Dale had never confused the two. He built a cabin above the flood line from timber he cut himself in the first autumn. He sank a root cellar. He set a south fence. By the summer of 1872, he had 20 head of cattle running on the eastern pasture, and a well dug close enough to the cabin that he did not lose much daylight hauling water. His wife, Margaret, managed the kitchen garden behind the cabin, and had the seasonal character of the land sorted inside a year of arriving, because she was the kind of person who learned a place by being inside it, rather than by measuring it from the outside. Margaret died of fever in September of 1873. She was 30 years old. She left behind the land and a 2-year-old son and nothing else Dale could hold. And for a long time after that, the cabin was quiet, in a way that the territory's own quiet did not account for. Thomas grew up on those 640 acres the way the grass grew on them, without hurry and without announcement. He learned horses before he learned arithmetic. He learned the eastern drainage's flood pattern by watching it in 4 seasons, not by being told. By 1882, he was 15 years old and moved through the world with the same economy his father did. And people in the settlement who had not seen them together sometimes mistook one for the other from a distance. Dale was 41 that spring. He was not a large man. He did not make himself known in a room before he was ready. He had worked for the Army as a scout during the Red River Campaign of 1874, tracking for cavalry columns across ground. He already knew better than the officers who ordered him out. Before that, he had been a hunter, and before that, a boy who had watched the territory change faster than the men in Washington could account for, which was faster still than the men in Washington chose to acknowledge. He had seen enough of what came before the treaties and what came after to understand that no piece of paper was permanent. What he had chosen to believe instead was that work was permanent, that a fence line properly set and maintained held its own kind of authority. He kept the Winchester from his scouting years in the trunk beneath the cabin floor, under his Army discharge papers and a folded survey map of the territory that no longer matched the territory that existed. He had not opened the trunk in some time. He had other concerns, which included a dry well on the north quarter that needed deepening before summer, and 23 head of cattle to move to the east pasture before the June heat settled in. That was how things stood in the spring of 1882, when Leonard Harker rode into Comanche Station on a Tuesday. The first thing people in the settlement noticed about Harker was that his suit was not dusty. He had come from Fort Sill by covered wagon and transferred to horseback at the station crossing, which meant he had arranged his arrival deliberately, which told anyone paying attention that he came to conduct business on terms he had already decided. He went to Webb's trading post, asked for the back table, ordered coffee, and spread survey maps across the surface before the cup arrived. He sent word to Dale Coleman through Felix Webb, who owned the trading post, and was uncomfortable enough in Harker's presence to send his boy out to the allotment road in person, rather than write the message down. Dale came in the following morning with Thomas riding behind him. The survey maps were the first argument. They covered the table in careful overlapping layers and showed the South Canadian corridor with the Consolidated Land Trust's right-of-way claim penciled across Dale's eastern quarter in straight, even lines. The lines ran exactly where the flat ground ran, because whoever had drawn them had understood that the eastern drainage was the land's real value. A rail line from the South Canadian crossing to the Wichita Junction needed level grade, and level grade went precisely where Dale's cattle pastured. "The trust holds right-of-way on this corridor under federal charter," Harker said. He spoke with a Fort Worth lawyer's unhurried certainty, the voice of a man who had said the same words in enough rooms that he no longer needed to rehearse them. "The claim predates your allotment grant by 14 months. I have the original filing here for your review." Dale stood across the table and read the seal at the bottom of the filing without picking it up, the way a man reads a brand on a distant animal, at a distance and in passing. The seal was a Bureau of Indian Affairs medallion impression. The date stamp beside it sat above the midline of the page. In every bureau document Dale had handled during his scouting years, and he had handled enough of them to know their conventions by reflex, the date went at the lower left, flush with the bottom margin. It didn't go where it sat on this page. He said nothing about this. Thomas was near the door. Dale could feel the particular stillness of the boy from across the room. Not movement, not restlessness, just attention. 30 days, Harker said. Vacate the eastern 320 acres by the 25th of May. The trust has no interest in the remainder of your allotment. If you want compensation for improvements made to the eastern quarter, file with the trust's territorial office. He set a second sheet on the table, a printed form with ruled lines for a signature. There's a process for it. Dale looked at Harker for a moment beyond what was comfortable for either man. He picked up his hat. He walked out, and Thomas fell into step behind him without being asked, and they rode home through the spring morning without speaking. That evening, Dale worked the south fence until the light was gone. The next morning, he asked Felix Webb to let him see the original filing Harker had left on record. Webb met his eyes for one moment and then looked down at the invoice on his counter. The document had been taken back to Fort Sill for procedural reasons. What remained was the 30-day notice addressed to Dale Coleman, allotment holder, Comanche Station, Indian Territory, sealed and stamped and complete. 3 weeks passed, and each one gave more than the last. The first week was silence. On the fourth day, 2 men from the trust rode the eastern fence line at mid-morning, taking measurements without authorization. They were surveyors, and they moved with the ease of men who expected the numbers to confirm what they already understood, which was that Dale's eastern quarter was flat and well graded, and ran precisely where a rail line needed to run. Dale watched them from the cabin porch. Thomas watched them from the corral fence. Neither of them spoke. The second week brought Ellis Voss. He arrived at the south fence on a Friday evening with Dade Tatum and Roy Crane behind him. Voss moved the way a former cavalry sergeant moves, upright and deliberate and always scanning the ground. And he had the look of a man who had read a great many difficult situations quickly and had not yet read one wrong. He called out that he was authorized by the Consolidated Land Trust to inspect the corridor, and then, without waiting for a response, he rode through the south fence and onto Dale's land. Thomas was on the porch. He watched his father come out of the barn at an unhurried walk and take up a position between the riders and the cabin. He watched Voss look at his father the way a man looks at an obstacle of known dimensions. Voss spoke for perhaps 2 minutes, citing authorization and survey rights in the trust's federal charter. Dale listened without expression. When Voss finished, Dale said nothing and did not move. Voss read this as the silence of a man without options, because in Voss's experience, that silence and any other kind were not distinguishable from each other, and nothing in his experience had yet required him to tell the difference. Voss turned and rode back through the gap. Tatum and Crane went with him. Dale waited until they were a quarter-mile out. Before he looked down at the fence post the horses had kicked loose coming through. Thomas came off the porch and stood beside him. "I'll fix it," Thomas said. "In the morning," Dale said. The horses were killed 9 days before the deadline. The bay gelding that Dale had worked for 7 years and a younger sorrel Thomas had been bringing along for 2 seasons. They were found at the south fence in the early morning with the dew still on the grass around them. Dale stood over the bay for a long time. Thomas stood behind him and kept his hands at his sides. The south fence burned that same night. Not the post timber, which was too green to catch fully, but the wire and the cedar rails between sections, 40 feet of it reduced to ash and bent metal. Before Dale smelled the smoke from the cabin and got outside, he stood in the dark and watched the glow at the south field's edge. Thomas was behind him, still dressed as though he had not yet gone to bed. The nearest neighbor was a Comanche farmer named Asa Brings Evening, whose allotment ran along the creek drainage a half-mile up the road. Dale could see the lamplight in his window from the field's edge. While he watched, it went dark. He did not hold this against Brings Evening. A man with children and a fence line and cattle could not place himself between a land syndicate and its survey maps. That was the calculation that kept a family on its land, and Dale understood the arithmetic, because he was working through the same figures and arriving at a different conclusion. 4 days before the deadline, Dale rode east to Fort Sill. The Bureau of Indian Affairs kept a subagent there named Gerald Morrow, a thin-shouldered man from Ohio who had held the posting for 3 years and maintained his records with the care of a man who knew no one above him would help him if the records turned out to be wrong. Dale had dealt with him twice, once over a grazing boundary question and once over a tax assessment that proved to be a copying error. Morrow wasn't a generous man. He was a precise one, which in the territory served the same purpose more reliably. Dale laid the 30-day notice on the desk and described the seal on Harker's original filing, the medallion impression, the date stamp placed above the midline of the page, the charter number Harker had cited. Morrow pulled 3 documents from his cabinet and arranged them beside the notice. He studied them for a long time without speaking. "The seal position you're describing," Morrow said at last. "That's a pre-75 format. The Trust's federal charter renewal came through in 1876. Any filing made under the renewed charter carries the revised seal, with the date printed at the lower left." He looked at Dale over the rim of his glasses. "The charter number cited in this notice corresponds to a survey filed in 1869. "Before my allotment grant," Dale said. "Before your allotment and before the Medicine Lodge review. If the document Mr. Harker showed you at the trading post carried the seal in the position you described it, it is not a valid filing under any federal protocol currently governing allotment land in the territory." Morrow picked up his pen. He said he could write to the trust's territorial representative in Fort Worth, noting the discrepancy and requesting the original document for review. He said this was within his authority to do. He said it in the deliberate way of a man who wants credit for the offer while being honest about its limits. And then he added that whether the trust chose to respond to that letter before the 25th of May was, he had to say plainly, outside of anything he could guarantee. Dale rode back to Comanche Station with the letter filed and the forgery confirmed by a man whose job required him to be careful about such things. 4 days remained before the deadline. Thomas had moved the remaining horses to the north quarter during Dale's absence. He had also restrung the burned section of the south fence with new wire and reset 2 posts, both of which he had done without being asked and without mentioning afterward. He was at the corral gate when Dale rode in, and the only question he asked was whether Dale had eaten anything on the road. "No," Dale said. Thomas went inside and put something on the fire. 2 days before the deadline, Dale came into Webb's trading post for grain, and Dade Tatum was in the center of the floor. Tatum was a compact man with a high color who had calibrated his voice over a working life to carry whether or not a room wanted to receive it. He was standing with his back to the shelves and 2 men behind him at the wall, and he was facing the door as if he had been there for some time already. He probably had. "Coleman," he said. It was the kind of greeting that is also a conclusion. 2 days. Felix Webb was behind the counter with an invoice in his hands that he was not reading. Dale went to the grain shelf and began counting sacks. "Man rides to Fort Sill," Tatum said, raising his voice to the room's dimensions. "Writes a letter to a clerk. Like a clerk's letter is going to hold down a federal land charter." He made a sound that was half laugh and half something colder. "Voss comes out the morning of the 25th with papers and the deputy from Anadarko. Crew of men behind him. You understand what that means." Dale set the grain sacks on the counter and counted out the coins one at a time. "I understand," Dale said. It was not what Tatum had been aiming for. It carried no anger and no heat. And without those things, it did not give Tatum the ground he needed to stand on. Tatum studied Dale for a moment with an expression that was not quite puzzlement. Then he said with more edge, 2 days, Coleman. After that, you go to wherever Kiowa men go when they run out of letters to write." Dale picked up the grain sacks. He walked to the door without looking back at the room. Thomas was outside with the horses, standing close to the building's wall, and the set of his face told Dale he had heard enough through the planks to know the shape of what had just happened inside. He watched his father load the grain onto the pack horse and check the cinch on his own horse with steady hands. And he did not speak. Dale stood with his hand on the saddle and looked at the road south, toward the allotment land he could not see from this distance, but knew the position of the way he knew any piece of ground he had worked across for 11 years, by memory and season and the accumulated weight of each day spent on it. Morrow's letter was traveling to Fort Worth. The deadline was 2 days off. Voss was coming with a deputy and papers and a crew of men, and he was coming with the confidence of a man who had correctly read every room he had ever walked into, and who had no reason to expect this one would be different. He mounted up. Thomas mounted beside him. They rode south without speaking, and when the trading post fell behind them and the allotment land began to show itself ahead, Dale let his eyes move across the eastern drainage and the repaired south fence and the low hill where the cabin sat, and he thought about the trunk beneath the cabin floor and the oilcloth packed tight around what was inside it, and the last time he had opened it. The trunk was beneath the cabin floor, under a section of plank near the east wall that fit its housing the way a lid fits a box, with the precision of something built to stay shut. Dale had measured the gap when he fitted it and packed the joint with a strip of cut leather so that it did not creak, which meant that when he came in and crossed to that corner and knelt and lifted the plank, Thomas, sitting at the table with his supper plate, heard nothing. Thomas watched. The trunk was Army surplus, canvas-wrapped and brass-cornered, still stenciled with a supply designation on the lid in ink that had not quite faded. Dale lifted it onto the floor beside the opening and sat on his heels and looked at it for a moment before he unsnapped the latches. The oilcloth was folded the way he had left it, with the Winchester nested inside at an angle to fit the trunk's depth. Army issue, from his scouting years, a rifle he had maintained through 3 campaigns and carried back with him when the Red River work was finished and the cavalry columns turned north and left the territory to its next arrangement. He had cleaned the rifle properly before he wrapped it, which was the kind of preparation that assumes a future use without naming one, and 11 years had not changed the condition of the metal or the grain of the walnut stalk. He checked the action and the bore. He counted the cartridges left in the trunk's side pocket, 42, and set 7 on the floor beside him, counted them again, and loaded the rifle. He wiped the stock with the corner of the cloth and held the rifle across his knees and looked at the floor in front of him for a time. Thomas had not moved from the table. Dale set the loaded rifle against the east wall where he could reach it from the bed. He replaced the oilcloth and closed the trunk and replaced the plank and stood up. "The morning of the 25th, he said. "I will be at the trading post before Voss arrives." Thomas looked at the rifle against the wall. He looked at his father. "I will be with you," Thomas said. Dale considered this with the same care he had given the bore of the rifle and the count of the cartridges, and he arrived at the same answer he had been arriving at for some time without being able to say it plainly, which was that keeping Thomas away from what was coming was no longer a thing he could arrange. "Stay at the hitching post," Dale said. "You stay back." Thomas said he would. Dale believed him the way a man believes any honest thing that may not hold under the actual conditions, and the distinction was one he could live with. They went to bed. The night was clear and cold, and the scrub oaks on the western ridge moved in a wind that came south off the Canadian. The cabin was quiet. Some men can read a formation across 50 yards of morning air and tell you before anyone has moved how the day will end. Dale was on the road to Comanche Station before the light was gray. Thomas rode 20 feet back, the way Dale had asked, and kept his horse at a walk matching his father's, and did not crowd the distance between them. The settlement was dark when they came in off the main road. The cottonwoods along the creek were still as cut timber. No one was about. Dale dismounted at Webb's trading post and tied his horse at the far end of the rail and stood with his back to the building's wall, facing the road that came from the south. He held the Winchester at his side with the barrel down. He did not wait long. Voss came up the main road with Tatum to his left and Crane to his right, and behind them a man Dale did not know wearing a tin badge from the Anadarko courthouse, who pulled up short when he reached the edge of the settlement and read the situation quickly enough to stay where he was. Whether this was good sense or cowardice was a distinction the Anadarko deputy had resolved in his own favor before any of them spoke, and he stayed on his horse at the road's edge with his hands visible on the pommel and no expression that said he was part of what was about to happen. Voss drew up and the 3 of them settled into their positions. Tatum on Voss's left, 40 feet out, where the road widened at the post's corner. Crane on the right at 45 feet, shoulder forward, the ground between him and Dale open and flat. Voss at center, 30 feet, sitting his horse for a moment before he stepped down and stood to his full height, because Voss preferred to finish these conversations on the ground, which meant he had not yet read the change in the morning. Thomas Coleman was at the hitching post behind his father, holding both horses, with his hands quiet on the reins. "Coleman," Voss said, "step away from the building." Dale stepped away from the building. He was in the road now, with the morning air between them and the creek somewhere behind the cottonwoods running its usual cold measure of the day. Voss looked at the Winchester at Dale's side with the level attention of a man cataloging information rather than reacting to it. Because Voss was a professional, and professionals did not react to rifles on sight. "The notice expired at sundown yesterday," Voss said. "Deputy Reese is authorized to oversee a lawful transition of the eastern 320 acres. You can come through this simple or difficult. Either way, it comes through." "The claim is forged," Dale said. Voss kept his expression steady. "That is a matter between your bureau clerk and the trust's territorial office. The seal is wrong," Dale said. "Morrow at Fort Sill documented it. The trust filed on a pre-75 charter seal for a 76 renewal. It is not a valid right-of-way." Something moved in Voss's expression. "Not doubt exactly." The first place where his read of the situation developed a seam. Tatum did not have Voss's discipline. Tatum's hand dropped for his gun with the speed of a man who has decided that talking is finished, and he was fast. Which was the thing that had kept him alive this long, and which was not fast enough now. Dale's Winchester came up level and fired once. Tatum went back and down against the post's corner boards, and the sound of the shot crossed the settlement and came back off the cottonwoods as flat and final as a door shutting. Rye Crane had his gun half clear of the holster when the second shot took him in the shoulder and sat him down hard in the road dirt. He stayed down. He did not try for the gun again. Voss had not drawn. He stood at 30 feet with his right hand away from his body and his palm open, and he was reading Dale Coleman across the morning air with an expression that had entirely changed from the one he had arrived with. The expression of a man who has finally received the information he lacked and understands now that he lacked it at every point before this one. The entire sequence had taken less time than it takes a fire to catch on dry cedar. "Ride back to Harker," Dale said. His voice carried the same level he had used when he told Thomas to stay at the hitching post, and when he described the seal position tomorrow, and when he picked up his hat and walked out the first time Harker spread his survey maps on the table. It had not changed pitch since morning. "Tell him what the ground looks like. Tell him Morrow's letter is already written." Voss looked at Crane in the road. Crane was alive, holding his shoulder, watching Dale from the ground with the focused attention of a man who has revised his plans entirely. "Crane needs a doctor," Voss said. "There is one in Anadarko," Dale said. "Your deputy can take him." Voss mounted his horse. The deputy came forward at a walk and helped Crane up and across a saddle, and the two of them rode south without a word exchanged between them. Voss watched this, then turned his horse north. He did not look back at Dale Coleman. He rode out of Comanche Station the way a man rides when he understands that looking back will not improve his circumstances. Felix Webb had the trading post door open a crack. He pushed it wider now. He looked at the road and at Dale, and at the shape of what had just happened, and his expression was that of a man who has lived near a long-standing debt and has just learned it has been settled. Thomas was still at the hitching post. He had not moved from the position he had taken when the riders came in. He was watching his father across the span of the road, and his face carried the same steadiness it had carried all spring, through the fence burning and the dead horses and the days when the question of whether they would be on their land in May had no clear answer. He was 16 years old, and he understood what he had just witnessed, and he did not need to say anything about it, and so he did not. Dale walked to the hitching post and took his horse's reins. Leonard Harker received Ellis Voss in the Consolidated Land Trust's Fort Sill office on the last day of May. He heard Voss's accounting of the morning. He listened to the part about the sealed documentation and the bureau clerk's letter without expression. Then he sat for a long time with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the survey maps he had brought from Fort Worth, which showed the South Canadian corridor in careful detail, and which now described a problem of jurisdictional complexity that his territorial lawyers had, by their own estimate, a limited appetite for pursuing. A dead Kiowa man on contested allotment land, with a bureau clerk's forgery documentation already filed, and a territorial deputy as witness to the confrontation, would travel from Comanche Station to the territorial press in the time it took a rider to cover the ground, and from the territorial press to the federal Indian Commissioner's office in the time it took a telegram. Harker understood this. The trust's model relied on quiet resolution, not inquiry. One man on that road would have cost the syndicate less than one federal inquiry. Harker drafted a letter to the Bureau's territorial subagent in mid-June, citing jurisdictional complexity and the disputed status of the pre-75 charter filing. The Consolidated Land Trust withdrew its right-of-way claim against the Coleman allotment. The letter did not acknowledge the forgery. It did not need to. The withdrawal was sufficient. Morrow sent a copy of the withdrawal notice to Dale Coleman by post-rider, with a brief accompanying note in his careful Ohio hand, saying the matter had been resolved in accordance with the allotment's original grant terms, and that the file had been updated accordingly. He offered no commentary on the trust's conduct, and made no mention of the events at Comanche Station. He was a precise man, and the facts of the file were sufficient for his purposes. Dale read the notice at the cabin table with Thomas across from him, folded it, and set it on the shelf beside his Army discharge papers without speaking. The south fence stood through the summer and into the fall. Asa Bring's evening rode over in early July and helped Dale restake a section of the north quarter that had sagged in the spring flooding, and neither of them spoke about the month of May. And the afternoon's work was finished before the heat peaked. They shared water from the well and parted in the same quiet they had arrived in. This was how things began to move again, not with ceremony and not with explanation, but with work that needed doing, and two men still standing to do it. Thomas turned 17 that August. He was working horses with a skill that had left Dale's coaching behind entirely, shaping their responses with a patience that came from somewhere in him that was entirely his own. He never mentioned the hitching post or the distance or the conditions under which he had kept himself back, and Dale did not raise it. The years that followed were not without difficulty. The Dawes Act survey came through in 1887 and parceled the 640 acres into smaller numbered allotments, reducing Dale's operational land and reassigning 3 portions of the eastern drainage he had managed for 15 years. He kept the central parcel, the north quarter, and the cabin. He sold the remaining cattle in 1888 at a fair price and used the money to repair the cabin roof and deepen the north well and set enough aside that Thomas, who was marrying a woman from the Anadarko settlement named Clara Poolaw, could build a second cabin on the north quarter without beginning in debt. Dale was at the wedding in the spring of 1889 and came home that evening and sat on the porch until dark. The land around the cabin was quiet. The creek ran. The cottonwoods moved. Thomas and Clara's first child was born in 1891. They named her Margaret. She had Clara's eyes and Thomas's way of going quiet when she was thinking, and she was not yet walking steadily before she understood that the land had a shape, that the south fence ran a certain distance, and the north creek flooded in certain springs, that the ridge on the western margin threw its shadow on the cabin porch in the late afternoon of July, and not of any other month. She learned these things the way her father had learned them from inside. By 1897, 2 more children had followed, and the government school opened on the central parcel that September. on land that had once been the eastern quarter's neighbor, the flat ground where Harker's survey lines had been penciled in careful parallel. The school was a single-room frame building with 4 windows and a bellpost outside the door, built by crews from the agency office at Anadarko and finished in 6 weeks. Dale was 66 years old that fall. The trunk with the oilcloth was still beneath the floorboard of the cabin, and the Winchester was still inside it, and it had not been opened since the night before, the 25th of May in 1882. He had not been able to stop what the government did with the 640 acres after the Dawes survey, and he had understood before it happened that he could not. He had stopped one specific part of it on one specific morning, with the Winchester and the knowledge of where men stand when they intend to end a conversation. That was the measure he had to account for. He had found it sufficient. On the morning the school opened, Thomas rode up the ridge road to where his father stood on the high ground above the central parcel. He brought 2 horses and said nothing about why. Dale was already there when he arrived, standing at the ridge's edge with his hands in his coat pockets, looking down at the frame building and the line of children moving through the door. Margaret was the first of his grandchildren through. She carried a lunch pail and wore her hair in the way her mother tied it, and she walked into the schoolhouse without looking back at the ridge because she was 7 years old, and the world in front of her was entirely sufficient. The second child, a boy named Dale Elias, who went by his middle name and moved fast everywhere he went, came through the door right behind his sister without catching the frame. The youngest, who was 4 and not yet school-age but had followed the other 2 to the door to see what it was turned back by a woman in a blue dress who came out and took her hand and walked her back toward the north quarter, and the child turned once to look at the school door before she went. Thomas stood beside his father without speaking. The morning air was cool and the sky above the territory was the kind of blue that only came in September. High and clean and without weather. Dale watched the school door until it closed. A hawk crossed the ridge from the west, riding a long flat line above the grass, and neither of them watched it go.